Hello, and welcome to Art Tells a Story, Let It Tell Yours, a production sponsored by the Reese Brothers, but which involves four different organizations talking to artists in our Columbus community. My name is Tyler Cann. I'm the head of exhibitions and Pizzuti family curator of contemporary art at the Columbus Museum of Art. And it's my great pleasure to be here with Sheilah and Dani ReStack for a kind of virtual studio visit and chat. And it's great to see you both. Um, there you go. Um, so maybe I'll just like introduce you both briefly, and then we can talk a little bit about your work. I know you have some images to show us as well. But I can just sort of briefly say that, well, Sheilah, who appears on your left, maybe raise your hand, Sheilah. There you go. So,
Hello.
is associate professor and chair of studio art at Denison University. And Dani is associate professor of drawing at OSU. They have embarked on, quite, I think, a very special artistic relationship that is really closely tied to their life together and the spaces they inhabit and the community around them. That kind of like everyday space. And so, since we are all in a moment right now that we are thinking very deeply about our immediate environments and our homes, where many of us are, although we should also spare a word for those who are forced out of their homes and into potentially quite dangerous situations in the course of their everyday lives. For those of us who have been at home for several weeks now, it's I thought maybe this is a kind of chance to talk to two artists who really engage questions of domesticity, and family quite deeply. So their collaborations have been shown at the Whitney Biennial 2017, Iceberg Projects in Chicago, Toronto International Film Festival, Images Film Festival, Toronto Lyric Theater, Leslie Lohman Project Space, GAA in Wellfleet, and of course the Columbus Museum of Art. Particularly in 2017, it was our Greater Columbus Arts Council Visual Arts exhibition, which was fantastic. So maybe I will also interject a trivia question here. The winner of this trivia question gets a $25 gift certificate to a piece of cake. And the question is, drum roll, what is the first museum chartered in the state of Ohio? And maybe bonus points if you can give us the date. So with that, let's turn to Dani and Sheilah. How are you?
Good. We're doing all right. We're at home and really grateful for the opportunity and happy to have a chance to talk to you, Tyler, and share, some thoughts and kind of have like some sort of virtual sense of community and being able to communicate at a time when it feels kind of like there's a lot of isolation. So thank you.
Can I want to start by sharing an image just to kind of give you a sense of how we are operating. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
That's a pile that we made in the kitchen. So that's how we made the image for the piece we made at the Columbus Museum of Art. We piled up in the kitchen, and then with the help of the installers there, we built this installation that when the video was on, you could see that, and when the video light turned white, this is what you could see, which was kind of an abstraction. I mean, it becomes abstract without the image. Like, I'll show you a detail of the dishes. So those are the dishes in the cabinet, which then become this when the light is on. Like, it's just white light rather than the video. So I just want to open with that as a way to be in a domestic space and invent.
So, I mean, I think that's really interesting, you know, because there is a kind of in that space. So the piece itself was called Stack, if I recall. Yep. And when you sort of walked in there, depending on which moment you arrived, you would either encounter that, you know, sort of for a brief moment, this kind of abstract space, and then all of a sudden this image would be overlaid on top of it. And even that felt a little abstract until there was a little bit of motion. It was these kind of like the slight movements that cued you into the fact that that this was indeed a video, and that these were, you know, sort of like actual bodies and plates, and you know, it was like a kitchen. And maybe that's, you know, there is a kind of like a metaphor there for like a house is just a house until people start living in it, and then it becomes a home. And then there's a whole layer of kind of like psychodynamics, you know, of emotion, of subjectivity that kind of gets laid on top of that. So I thought your installation actually kind of reminded me of our own relationship to the spaces in which we sort of live or inhabit in a kind of interesting way. There was a sort of an audio component to that as well, no?
Yeah.
Do you want to share our last name, because that's related to the audio?
Yeah. The audio was from Ann Carson's work. It was a whole series of kind of small lectures that had been pulled together into kind of like a compilation called Float. And this particular piece was called Stack. And it was like a whole list it begins with a list. And then she kind of goes into it and sort of, she does this like really beautiful meld between like kind of ancient mythology and, you know, contemporary life, and sort of pulls from both and kind of endows them with a sort of like living feeling of both ancient and present. And anyway, but that list that she went over was what was being repeated inside of that space. So it was like thunderstorm stack, you know, stack for
Jezebel,
that's right.
All kinds of stacks. And we actually gave ourselves the name, our last name, ReStack, based on that poem. So there's a tie that way as well.
Yeah. It was like this like desire for like just being able to, like, there was something actually very liberating about like, just like, you're like, oh, like I thought a name was this static thing, and like actually you can change it, you know, like, so this idea of like the sort of, I don't know, like empowerment of like an individual, like in relation to like just changing a name or like restacking, you know, priority, kind of going against some sort of like patriarchal, you know, order system, you know, like, so those were, it seemed really important at the time, and still does, actually. It continues to be relevant.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of connection between the sort of ordinary and conventional, I mean, things as simple as a name, you know, we don't tend to think about those. We kind of receive them. But I think the fact of changing your name is really emblematic of sort of, in a way, what you've tried to do in general in terms of, you know, connecting your ordinary lives to kind of larger, grander even more sort of like mysterious and beautiful things. But I had a question actually that was not, that was maybe a little bit more simple, is like, how did you start to think of yourselves as an artist, I mean, as an artist couple? You both have in independent kind of established practices. But then the idea to sort of join forces into a kind of collaborative entity is an interesting leap. Tell me about that.
Yeah.
I would say both of us in our individual way have always dealt with the present. Like our work always is about where we are, what is currently sort of pulling at the heart at that time. So we each have taken those things on. And then when we got together, like I would say there's no greater challenge than love. And so like to step towards things, if that's the way we operate as people and artists in the world, it makes perfect sense to step into making together and take that subject on. And plus, like, for me, my work is my most core self, is my identity of and my heart place is in the work. So to open that up to Sheilah and be able to work together is like, I couldn't be any closer to anybody else, because that's, the closest place.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if
I
it's
feel
the
like
core element of yourself, it's like there's
Yeah.
really no option but to to share that, if you're really going to share everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that thing that like you would always like wish of your students, allow yourself to be vulnerable, right? And it's like there could be nothing more vulnerable, I agree with Dani, than making work together, because work comes from this like very raw interior sort of space, and to allow another person into that is like, it takes like an immense amount of work, to be able to do that. But I was gonna say, like, in terms of this idea of like artist couple, like I feel like we're very much like different people. You know what I mean? Like I feel like our energies are so different, and yet there's something that comes, and we have this kind of autonomy, but then there's something that comes from like putting those energies together that yields something else that like continues to be like exciting, and we're curious about it, and takes hard work that yields like surprising results. And so like that's kind of what I think keeps us committed. And I don't think there's like some sort of like master plan of like we're going to be like an artist couple for all time, but it's like this is what feels really generative right now, so let's do this. So yeah.
That's really I think it's quite brave to step into that a collaborative space. When we tend to think of artists as being kind of alone in their garrets. It's a cliche, of course, but a lot of my artist friends at the moment are like, actually my life hasn't changed very much at all. I'm always in the studio and doing my thing, and but to kind of like open that relationship up, which could also, I guess, quite easily be a sort of ordinary doesn't seem quite the word. I was thinking of your work, the work, your piece, a trilogy, in fact, titled "Strangely Ordinary." This devotion. So I mean, maybe we can talk about the word ordinary in a bit, but it could be quite easy to kind of have an ordinary life walled off from your lives as artists. We can compartmentalize like that all the time, but you have broken down that barrier in a really kind of intense way in your work. But it made me curious, sort of like, and you're often actually working in your home if you're filming something, and with your family, with your daughter, And I was just curious, like how that you know, how you cross that line from a kind of having breakfast to making art, you know, or is that, are you just sort of constantly shooting and making work and then figuring it out later in the studio? Or is it more the case that you are sort of, you have you know, hours where you work together and then you know, and then build up to turning the camera on or something like that?
Can I share the screen?
Yeah, sure.
So I'll share the screen so we so that we can show that. This is an instance where we couldn't get a babysitter, and so we were home, and Rose was sleeping upstairs, so we went outside to make a shot in the hammock in the backyard. And you know, there's stones out there and a couple seashells, and so the ordinary is like the backyard, but then we can compose something to tell a story, or just change it up. This was a moment of ritual in the video for conducting magic, and it was all tied to water. The whole project of Strangely Ordinary this devotion was about the water crisis, and the magic that we wanted to bring as a solution to that problem was a fantasy where we had a magic that could allow children to breathe underwater.
To live without water.
Live without water. I'm sorry. Yeah. They're not living underwater. Here's us underwater. We did a lot of underwater shots, but so the idea. Here's an example of the kitchen with a bag of water hanging. We rigged up a cable and hung this bag of water that had a feather in it, and it just became part of the kitchen for a while, and it changes the kitchen.
And I think, like, in relation to your question too, Tyler, like there's so many different levels of engagement in terms of, like, sometimes something is happening and it's like, it's really funny, or it's really beautiful, or it's just like, and you're just like, boom, like gotta like document that. It's that like urge for like documentation. And I think both of us, sometimes we're like totally like mind reading, like this needs to be documented. And, you know, then we also have things that we kind of move towards on our own. And then there's also like those things that are like much more planned because they're part of the narrative, which experimental narrative, like it may not be like explicit to a viewer, but we may decide that, you know, there needs to be a shoot in our alley, and it could be like highly constructed, you know, like we know at what time people are coming over, we know we're going to film it, you know, and we know exactly what they're going to do. So there's like all of these kind of different levels of how we pull footage together. And then there's also just like a kind of heightened sensitivity, like of when you're engaged in a particular project, I think you start to see the world through those eyes. And so you'll like start to, if we're working on a particular video, you'll start to see things that fit into that logic. And so that kind of like, I think that also is another way of sort of pulling, you know, material that we could use. So I think it's like a sort of variation between all of those things. And I agree, like there is something like kind of deeply, I hesitate to use the word radical because I know, but like deeply honest and vulnerable about it. But I think that that's one of the places where, like, for me, like collaboration, it's like we're doing this together, you know what I mean? And by together, I even mean as a family, you know, like that this is like something we engage in together. And there's something about that sort of like shared work that makes it easier to kind of like put out into the world because we've worked on it collaboratively.
Mm-hmm.
This is an example of a highly constructed shot, and so was that drone shot. Like we didn't just shoot those off the cuff, right? We had to invite people, and we set up a screen, and projection out there and had a drone operator. And then this, for instance, we made this space all yellow. So sometimes it's very considered, thought through, and planned. And then other times, like this shot here, we were thinking about the alley, and our friend Dan Jan stopped by, and we were like, hey, you want to go to the alley and shoot in the, dig up this plant and bury a stone for this piece we're working on? And she was like, sure. So we did it.
And that's right in the, right in the alley behind your house there.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that's key. It's got to be like readily accessible. You're going to be able to have to walk to it without hiring a babysitter. So I think that's, I guess, like when you were talking about the normal or the banal, like that is like a place of interest, because it's like, how can you make this kind of space that feels like it does get compartmentalized as like not interesting? How can you reinvigorate that, because that is what's available to us, right? So it's like, well, how can we use it, or how can it become something else? And like, I think that fantasy plays a part, and that is something that I think we learn partly from Rose as well, because she's absolutely capable, and I'm sure Teo is too, of like being in a room and then suddenly like on another planet. You know what I mean? Like their imaginative world is like really flexible. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way. I mean, we learn a lot from our children, and I think there's a way where, children and maybe pets as well, kind of enchant that every day. They bring something, quite different to it, or very sort of. But I think this is like, I mean, when I think of your work, I really think about a kind of startling sense of honesty, a feeling that you're really sort of deliberate about revealing something of your lives. It can be quite intimate, or it could be quite regular, or it could be quite heightened, by this sense of, ritual, or making, filling it with something that is kind of deep and meaningful. And I guess my question is like, what is that? What is that something, and how does it, what's the relationship between that sort of intent to create something that is really generative and, evocative, and the art making kind of process itself? Like, does the art making itself all of a sudden bring that sense of enchantment of the ordinary? Could it exist apart from that? Or do you think you really need the sort of the onus to create something to make that happen?
So that's a complicated question, but I feel like one of the things in terms of like, one simple way to say it is like, why do you guys show all that private space on the screen? Like, why would you do that? And there's intention there, because when do you see lesbian made film of lesbian? Mostly men make lesbian film. And so here's lesbians making the work, showing the everyday, or, intimacy as a way of like saying, normalizing it. Like it's just our family. Here's how our family works. And it never has airtime, not much airtime. So we're going to make sure there is some airtime. And, there's kind of hierarchy that seems to exist between the personal and the theoretical. Like art that's personal sometimes is deemed sentimental or something. And we work really hard to not do that, and to, translate the personal into a formal gesture. But the personal is political. obviously.
Exactly.
And you know, there's something, you know, maybe someone will relate. Most likely they would, because they're a person. If we're going to operate, if we're going to share our personness in an honest way, then somebody else will probably identify with it. And that's the connection piece that is why it's worthwhile to show anything.
Yeah. I think honesty, like there's something felt, you know, like in terms of, I think the work, like there's like a felt quality to even the way that sense is created. It's a very sort of like visceral or haptic kind of relationship. So it's like a felt relationship. But I think that like honesty or like kind of vulnerability is also like, it's something that people can feel when it's real. So, and I think that that's like a really interesting thing to think about, that that's like something that they can identify with. And I think that on that other level, that it is like, yeah, please, like, can we have some images of the things that I never saw, you know, like as a child? And I mean, there's so many other things that need to be made as well, too. But this is just like, I mean, when we filmed like DIY insemination, it's like, that was just like not part of my like vocabulary growing up in rural Nova Scotia. And it feels like pretty great to be able to like make something and be like, yeah, this is okay. You can make work about this, you know, and make it evocative and beautiful and potent and unknowable, you know, like as well. And so I think that that is a big part of it. But I also feel like in that same way, there's like a reclamation to be made for the domestic space itself. Like it feels like so shut down in some ways. And I feel like, you know, when you're talking about what is that thing, it's like, could it be like the possibility for like fantasy to coexist with our most mundane kind of, you know, things that we do? Like, is that like what the space is asking? Is that what it's asking? I don't really know. I mean, and I know that at one point Dani like used the word like feral domestic in relation to the work, and that like kind of implies like something recognizable and unrecognizable, you know, at the same time. And I feel like that's like a nice way of thinking about that kind of friction of like, what's happening? I know this, but yet I don't.
And if feral could mean for humans like refusal, I'm going to be a refusenik to the status quo. My whole life is not going to be about scrambling for more. Okay, so I'm going to have a feral approach, which means follow my dreams or something. I mean, or like make choices, you know, that are like how to raise a kid and how to spend a day, you know, restack the priority type of thing. And I can say that would be a feral domestic, because I'm refusing to be a cog in the machine.
But I also think it can be like feral once you do something, once you make an action, once you push on something, once you hang a water bag in the kitchen, it's like suddenly even like, you know, pouring out the Rice Krispies has like a different kind of feel to it. You know what I mean? Like it's like it kind of like it pushes other things into a place of unrecognizability as well. So that's like, it's not just the feral act, it's like how the other boring things like look up against it.
I love this notion of, I mean, I love the kind of the sensuousness of your work, and because it does connect, I think, to the viewer on a really visceral level, but also this layer that you're kind of describing as like fantasy, and how that can sort of animate our lives, and make them strange, and make us sort of think about the kind of, and rethink the kind of conventions around like the definition of the family and how we relate to each other, and, you know, to make them sort of our own, and make them anew by making them weird first, you know, as an image, and being like, oh, actually, you know, that is possible. You know, it's immensely, I think, freeing in your work, and I love it. I know, you know, we're in a moment where there's so many people doing these kind of creative disruptions to their lives. I mean, people have a bit more time at home now, and they're the museum, or many museums around the country, around the world, have sort of challenged people with particular things. I asked you before this to kind of like maybe think of some creative challenge that you could offer our viewers right now. So please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think the thing that is possible for every single person is pay attention. So it's just about like, I was thinking about the cat and how like if it's just a cat taking a nap over there. But if I zoom in, like all I need to do is like do like this. I can zoom into his fur and start to think about texture and color, and like all of a sudden it's a potential place to engage in a different way. So I think the possibilities are endless for when it's just about paying attention.
Yeah, I was, earlier Dani was suggesting something else, which was like to take something from one place and put it into another. So like take something that you would never expect to put into the kitchen and like put it in the kitchen and just live with it for a while, and then see what happens, and kind of like observe your own kind of reactions. And how long does it take to get, comfortable with like a bag of water hanging in your kitchen, and like, so just that idea of like switching up, expectations of spaces.
I love it. I'm going to try something like that. I'm sure.
Okay. We want proof.
Yeah. Well, I think our time is up, but I've loved talking to you both. Thank you so much for doing this. And
thank you.
Yeah, and maybe hold up that card again that you had.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, everybody, all Nikki and everyone.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Should we sign out?
Do we leave the meeting?